The stars outside the small spaceship seemed like nothing more than distant lights, fading in the vast emptiness of space. Zalcor, the young alien prince, stood frozen at the control panel. His mind was racing, thoughts clashing like thunder in his chest. The Illyrian Empire was falling apart, and with it, everything he had ever known. "Prince, we need to move," came the familiar voice of Derek, the human mechanic who had risked his life to help him. Zalcor hesitated. His people had taught him to trust no one, especially not a human. The Illyrians had once ruled the galaxy, but now they were weak, divided, and yet here he was trusting a human, someone who had sworn to protect him. Why? Why had Derek kept his promise, when no one else had ever kept their word? The ship jolted suddenly, and the low hum of the engines was replaced by the sound of alarms blaring. The Illyrian fleet was close. Too close. They had been chasing them for days, and now they were in the final stretch of a desperate escape. "Are you ready to fly?" Derek's voice cut through the chaos. He was standing behind the control panel, his hands flying over the buttons, repairing broken circuits with nothing but tools and sheer willpower. Zalcor looked up at the human, seeing the determination in his eyes. He had always thought humans were weak. They were smaller, slower, and often considered inferior to the advanced alien species. But Derek had proven him wrong time and time again. Every moment since that first act of kindness, when Derek had pulled him from the wreckage of his ship during a bloody battle, had been a lesson in humanity's strength. Zalcor clenched his fists. "Why are you doing this? You don't owe me anything." Derek paused, meeting the prince's gaze. His expression softened for a moment. "You don't owe me anything either. I promised, and I always keep my word." The ship rocked again, this time harder. They were under fire. Zalcor stumbled, catching himself against the wall, his mind flashing back to the promise Derek had made years ago. Flashback. The first time they met, the first time Derek had sworn that he would protect Zalcor, no matter the cost. It had been after the prince had narrowly escaped an assassination attempt, a plot led by his own people. In that moment, Derek had stood as the only person willing to help him, not out of duty or allegiance, but out of sheer human compassion. Zalcor remembered how he had dismissed Derek's words, seeing them as nothing more than a fleeting promise made in desperation. But now, as a human worked to keep them alive, the weight of those words felt real. Derek had kept his promise. The human had kept his promise. The fight for survival. The prince's thoughts were cut short as another missile blast shook the ship. Sparks flew from the control panel and the lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the room. Derek's hands moved quickly, fixing wires and rerouting power. "We don't have much time. They're closing in. If we don't make it to the outer rim of the system, we're done for," Derek said, his voice focused but strained. Zalcor swallowed hard. "What's the plan? How do we escape?" Derek glanced back at him, his face set with resolve. "I'm going to get us through this. I promised, didn't I?" The prince felt his chest tighten, something heavy weighing down on him. They were alone, the two of them, surrounded by enemies and an uncertain future. And yet, there was something in Derek's voice, something that made him believe that no matter the odds, Derek would do whatever it took to keep his promise. The human's unwavering dedication was more powerful than any weapon. It was the one thing that could save them. As the enemy ships began to close in, Derek spoke again. "You need to trust me, Zalcor. I know it's hard, but we can do this together." The prince's struggle. Zalcor clenched his jaw, torn between his pride and the overwhelming truth in Derek's words. Humans had been weak in his eyes, but now, in the face of danger, Derek was proving that sometimes the greatest strength wasn't in power or weapons. It was in keeping your word, no matter the cost. "Trust you?" Zalcor spat. "I've been betrayed by my own people. My father, my closest advisors, they've all failed me. Why would I trust a human?" The ship shook violently, and Zalcor almost lost his footing. He looked over at Derek, who was still working, his hands moving like lightning. The human didn't respond with words. He didn't need to. His actions were the answer. The prince's heart began to pound harder. He had spent his entire life preparing for leadership, for greatness. But now, Here he was, depending on a human mechanic who had no reason to help him. The unexpected revelation. But as the ship continued to shake under fire, something inside Zalcor shifted. He felt a sudden pang of vulnerability, something he had never allowed himself to feel. In the midst of the chaos, the prince realized something deep and profound. The promise wasn't about power or politics or race. It was about trust. Zalcor's mind flashed back to the moment Derek had pulled him from the wreckage all those years ago. The prince had been broken, battered, and alone. But Derek had been there, extending a hand without hesitation. A promise to save him. A promise to protect him. And now, Derek was living up to that promise, even at the risk of his own life. The breaking point. The ship's hull groaned under pressure. The missiles were getting closer. Derek's face was grim, but his eyes never left the controls. The sound of the enemy ships closing and grew louder. "Father, look!" Zalcor whispered to himself, tears welling in his eyes. He had never been this vulnerable. The human had kept his promise, when no one else had ever done the same. The human had saved him. Again. With the enemy ships closing in, Zalcor finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "You were right, Derek. I've been blind. I trust you." The stars outside the small spaceship seemed like nothing more than distant lights, fading in the vast emptiness of space. Zalcor, the young alien prince, stood frozen at the control panel. His mind was racing, thoughts clashing like thunder in his chest. The Illyrian Empire was falling apart, and with it, everything he had ever known. "Prince, we need to move," came the familiar voice of Derek, the human mechanic who had risked his life to help him. Zalcor hesitated. His people had taught him to trust no one, especially not a human. The Illyrians had once ruled the galaxy, but now they were weak, divided. And yet, here he was, trusting a human, someone who had sworn to protect him. Why? Why had Derek kept his promise, when no one else had ever kept their word? The ship jolted suddenly, and the low hum of the engines was replaced by the sound of alarms blaring. The Illyrian fleet was close. Too close. They had been chasing them for days, and now they were in the final stretch of a desperate escape. "Are you ready to fly?" Derek's voice cut through the chaos. He was standing behind the control panel, his hands flying over the buttons, repairing broken circuits with nothing but tools and sheer willpower. Zalcor looked up at the human, seeing the determination in his eyes. He had always thought humans were weak. They were smaller, slower, and often considered inferior to the advanced alien species. But Derek had proven him wrong time and time again. Every moment since that first act of kindness, when Derek had pulled him from the wreckage of his ship during a bloody battle, had been a lesson in humanity's strength. Zalcor clenched his fists. "Why are you doing this? You don't owe me anything." Derek paused, meeting the prince's gaze. His expression softened for a moment. "You don't owe me anything either. I promised, and I always keep my word." The ship rocked again, this time harder. They were under fire. Zalcor stumbled, catching himself against the wall, his mind flashing back to the promise Derek had made years ago. Flashback. The first time they met, the first time Derek had sworn that he would protect Zalcor, no matter the cost. It had been after the prince had narrowly escaped an assassination attempt, a plot led by his own people. In that moment, Derek had stood as the only person willing to help him, not out of duty or allegiance, but out of sheer human compassion. Zalcor remembered how he had dismissed Derek's words, seeing them as nothing more than a fleeting promise made in desperation. But now, as a human worked to keep them alive, the weight of those words felt real. Derek had kept his promise. The human had kept his promise. The fight for survival. The prince's thoughts were cut short as another missile blast shook the ship. Sparks flew from the control panel and the lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the room. Derek's hands moved quickly, fixing wires and rerouting power. "We don't have much time. They're closing in. If we don't make it to the outer rim of the system, we're done for," Derek said, his voice focused but strained. Zalcor swallowed hard. "What's the plan? How do we escape?" Derek glanced back at him, his face set with resolve. "I'm going to get us through this. I promised, didn't I?" The prince felt his chest tighten, something heavy weighing down on him. They were alone, the two of them, surrounded by enemies and an uncertain future. And yet, there was something in Derek's voice, something that made him believe that no matter the odds, Derek would do whatever it took to keep his promise. The human's unwavering dedication was more powerful than any weapon. It was the one thing that could save them. As the enemy ships began to close in, Derek spoke again. "You need to trust me, Zalcor. I know it's hard, but we can do this together." The prince's struggle. Zalcor clenched his jaw, torn between his pride and the overwhelming truth in Derek's words. Humans had been weak in his eyes, but now, in the face of danger, Derek was proving that sometimes the greatest strength wasn't in power or weapons. It was in keeping your word, no matter the cost. "Trust you?" Zalcor spat. "I've been betrayed by my own people. My father, my closest advisors, they've all failed me. Why would I trust a human?" The ship shook violently, and Zalcor almost lost his footing. He looked over at Derek, who was still working, his hands moving like lightning. The human didn't respond with words. He didn't need to. His actions were the answer. The prince's heart began to pound harder. He had spent his entire life preparing for leadership, for greatness. But now, here he was, depending on a human mechanic who had no reason to help him. The unexpected revelation. But as the ship continued to shake under fire, something inside Zalcor shifted. He felt a sudden pang of vulnerability, something he had never allowed himself to feel. In the midst of the chaos, the prince realized something deep and profound. The promise wasn't about power or politics or race. It was about trust. Zalcor's mind flashed back to the moment Derek had pulled him from the wreckage all those years ago. The prince had been broken, battered, and alone. But Derek had been there, extending a hand without hesitation. A promise to save him. A promise to protect him. And now, Derek was living up to that promise, even at the risk of his own life. The breaking point. The ship's hull groaned under pressure. The missiles were getting closer. Derek's face was grim, but his eyes never left the controls. The sound of the enemy ships closing and grew louder. "Father, look!" Zalcor whispered to himself, tears welling in his eyes. He had never been this vulnerable. The human had kept his promise, when no one else had ever done the same. The human had saved him. Again. With the enemy ships closing in, Zalcor finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "You were right, Derek. I've been blind. I trust you." The ship raced through the void of space, now a mere speck among the stars, surrounded by the remains of enemy ships drifting in the wake of the recent battle. The immediate threat had been vanquished, but the Galactic War was far from over. The real battle lay ahead, the battle for survival, for loyalty, and for the promise that had been made long ago. Zalcor sat in the quiet of the command deck, staring out at the stars, still processing the recent events. His mind kept replaying the image of Derek, sweat on his brow, working tirelessly to keep them both alive. It was hard to fathom how one human could do so much for someone who had once viewed his kind as inferior. The prince clenched his fists, the weight of everything pressing down on him. His people, the Illyrian, had once been the rulers of the galaxy, their empire stretching across countless worlds. But now, they were scattered on the verge of extinction. Zalcor had watched as his people turned on one another, torn apart by greed, ambition, and betrayal. He had never imagined that his salvation would come in the form of a human mechanic, someone from a species his people had always dismissed. "Prince, we're approaching the outer rim of the system." Derek's voice came over the intercom, steady and calm, like he had done 1,000 times before. "We should be safe here, at least for now." Zalcor looked up, seeing Derek enter command room, a tired but determined expression on his face. The human walked over to the control panel and started running a quick diagnostic check on the ship systems. "You've been working nonstop," Zalcor said, his voice soft but filled with admiration. "You need rest." Derek shook his head, not bothering to look up. "I can rest when the job is done. We're not safe yet. The Illyrian fleet will regroup, and we can't afford to be caught off guard again." Zalcor couldn't argue with that. The Illyrian were powerful, and they would never stop hunting him. But in that moment, the prince felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. The kind of hope he had once believed was impossible. He wasn't alone anymore. Derek was with him, and together they had already defied the odds. The silence between them lingered, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a kind of silence that spoke volumes. Trust had been built, and with it, a bond that neither race had ever known before. Finally, Zalcor broke the silence. "Derek, I don't understand. Why are you doing this?" Derek paused for a moment, then turned to face him. His expression was unreadable, his eyes filled with a quiet determination. "I told you before. I gave my word." Zalcor stood and walked over to him. "But you're not just keeping a promise. You're risking your life. For me, you don't owe me anything." Derek met his gaze, his voice steady but carrying emotion that struck deep within Zalcor's heart. "I owe you nothing, but I gave my word. That's enough for me." The prince's chest tightened as he felt an unfamiliar lump in his throat. For the first time in his life, he didn't have an answer. His entire upbringing had been about power, domination, and the belief that strength was everything. But Derek had shown him a different kind of strength. The strength to keep a promise. The strength to act on loyalty and trust. Suddenly, the ship jolted, throwing both of them off balance. The alarms blared once more. Zalcor's heart raced as he grabbed the edge of the control panel to steady himself. Derek immediately sprang into action, his hands flying over the controls. "Try and stabilize the ship." "They found us," Derek muttered under his breath, eyes narrowed with focus. Zalcor felt a wave of panic rise in his chest, but he quickly squashed it. He couldn't afford to panic. Not now. Derek needed him to be strong, just like he had been for the human in the past. He took a deep breath and moved to assist Derek. "What's the plan?" Zalcor asked, his voice firm despite the storm brewing inside him. Derek didn't look up. "We need to get to the nearest moon base. It's our only chance. If we can make it there, we can repair the ship and regroup." Zalcor nodded. "Then we go." The ship shuddered again, the enemy missiles now only a moment away from hitting. Derek's hands were flying over controls with incredible speed, directing the ship through evasive maneuvers. But Zalcor knew they couldn't keep this up for long. The ship was damaged, and they were running out of time. "Hold on," Derek shouted as the ship veered to the left, narrowly avoiding a missile. The blast rattled the hull, but the ship remained intact. Zalcor couldn't help but feel a rush of admiration. Derek's skills were nothing short of amazing. The prince had never thought of humans as being capable of such precision, such intelligence. But Derek wasn't just a mechanic. He was the key to their survival. The true strength of a human was not just in their hands, but in their hearts. Derek had shown Zalcor that even when everything seemed lost, loyalty and honor could carry them through. "Derek," Zalcor said, his voice calm yet filled with deep emotion, "I can't do this without you." The human looked up at him then, his tired eyes meeting the prince's. There was a flicker of something in Derek's gaze, something that spoke of understanding, of mutual respect. Without a word, Derek nodded, his hands continuing to work with precision. They were in this together, no matter the odds. The ship's hull groaned again, the weight of the enemy's pursuit pressing down on them. But Derek's unwavering focus and Zalcor's growing trust in the human made all the difference. They had survived the first battle. Now, the real test would be whether they could make it to the moon base, escape the wrath of Illyrian, and, ultimately, keep the promise. The seconds felt like hours as the ship twisted and turned through the void of space. Zalcor's hands gripped the edge of the seat as the lights flickered again, casting long shadows across the room. The ship's hull groaned under the pressure of evasive maneuvers, and the blaring alarms sounded in the background. The enemy fleet was still hot on their tail, but Derek, the human mechanic, remained calm, his eyes focused on control panels as his hands moved with practiced precision. "You're incredible," Zalcor muttered under his breath, watching as Derek adjusted the ship's trajectory, narrowly avoiding a barrage of missiles. Derek didn't even glance up. "It's not about being incredible. It's about doing what has to be done. I made a promise to you, and I'll keep it." Zalcor couldn't help but be overwhelmed by Derek's resolve. The human wasn't just a mechanic. He was a force of nature. Despite the odds, Derek had kept his word. No one had ever done that for Zalcor before. His entire life, he had been trained to rely on his own power, his own people. But now, with the ship's engines failing and the warship crumbling around them, it was Derek who was holding everything together. The moon base. Zalcor glanced at the readouts on the control panel. They were nearing the moon base, the only chance they had left. It was a small, forgotten outpost on the edge of the system, barely registered on the galactic maps. But it was their last hope. If they could make it there, they could repair the ship, rest, and maybe, just maybe, find a way to escape the relentless pursuit of the Illyrian fleet. "We're almost there," Derek said, his voice cutting to the tension in the air. "Stay focused, Zalcor. We can't afford to slip up now." Zalcor nodded, even though his heart was racing. He had been prepared to die for his people, to die for the Empire. But now, as they neared the moon base, he realized he wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for something much more personal, for the promise that had been made, and for the bond he had formed with Derek, a bond that had grown stronger with every passing moment. The enemy's last stand. Suddenly, the ship jolted again, throwing Zalcor to the floor. The lights flickered and dimmed, and the ship's emergency alarm sounded. Derek grunted, quickly regaining control of the ship as it veered toward the moon base's orbit. "We've got a problem," Derek said, his voice tight with strain. "They've sent a fleet ahead of us. We're not going to make it unless I can fix this, now." Zalcor scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to help. He had to do something. But he had no idea what he could possibly do. All he had ever known was command. He had never been trained to be a mechanic, never been taught to fly a ship or repair systems under pressure. The realization, then something in him clicked. The human had trusted him, fought for him, risked his life countless times. This wasn't just about Derek's promise anymore. This was about their promise. A promise they had made together. A promise to survive, to escape the wrath of the Illyrian. Zalcor moved quickly to the nearest console, his hands trembling as he began to input commands. It wasn't much, but he knew the basic systems from his training. They were on the brink of collapse, but he wouldn't let Derek do this alone. Not this time. "Zalcor, what are you doing?" Derek called out, noticing the prince's actions. "I'm helping," the prince said, determination lacing his voice. "You're not the only one who can keep a promise." Derek looked at him, his eyes filled with surprise, but he didn't stop Zalcor. Instead, he simply nodded and turned back to the controls. Together, they were working in perfect sync, a strange unity forming between them in the heat of battle. The final push. With the ship on the verge of collapse, they fought back, their combined efforts pushing them closer and closer to the moon base. The enemy ships were relentless, their weapons charging for one final attack. Zalcor could see the darkness of space closing in around them, the moon base just beyond their reach. But the enemy was right behind them, and they would not stop until they had destroyed everything in their path. "I won't let you down, Derek," Zalcor said, his voice steady. Derek glanced at him, his face unreadable for a moment. Then, for the first time, the human smiled. It was brief, but it was enough to send a surge of hope through Zalcor's chest. "We're in this together," Derek said simply, and with that, he pushed the ship's engines to their limit. The warship lurched forward, breaking through the barrage of fire. The ship's shields flickered dangerously as they approached the moon base's outer atmosphere. They were so close. Too close. The final countdown. Zalcor could hear the enemy ships closing in, their weapons ready to fire. But just as all seemed lost, Derek slammed his hands down on the final command. The ship lurched forward one last time, rocketing toward the moon base as enemy missiles exploded just behind them, sending shock waves through the hull. "Hold on," Derek shouted. The ship crashed through the outer atmosphere, and Zalcor could feel the force of the impact throw him back into his seat. The ship shuddered violently, but they were safe. For the moment, they were safe. Zalcor's chest heaved with the exertion of everything that had just happened. They had made it. Together, the promise fulfilled. As the ship coasted down toward the surface of the moon, Zalcor turned to Derek. There were no words left. The prince couldn't express what he was feeling. He had never experienced such raw emotion, such overwhelming gratitude. Derek, for his part, looked exhausted, But there was something in his eyes, a look of quiet pride, of a promise kept. "You kept your promise," Zalcor said, his voice thick with emotion. Derek nodded. "And you kept yours." Zalcor sat back in his seat, his heart still pounding in his chest. He had been wrong about humans. Wrong about everything. And now, he was beginning to understand the true meaning of honor, loyalty, and trust. The promise that had started all those years ago wasn't just about survival. It was about something far greater. It was about the strength of a bond between two very different beings. A bond that could not be broken by war, betrayal, or time. And for the first time in his life, Zalcor understood that, with a promise like that, anything was possible. The quiet hum of the ship's damaged engines was the only sound as Zalcor sat in the darkened command room, the moon base looming outside the viewports. The tension in the air was thick. Each breath he took felt heavier than the last. His thoughts kept drifting back to the battle they had just narrowly survived. The Illyrian fleet had been relentless, but somehow, against all odds, they had made it to the moon base, their last hope for survival. Derek stood in front of the ship's control panel, his face illuminated by the flickering lights. He was working furiously, running diagnostics, trying to repair the damage to the ship that had been inflicted during the escape. The human's hands moved quickly, but Zalcor could see the exhaustion in his eyes. He had barely rested since the moment they had been attacked. But Derek never stopped. He hadn't even hesitated when the prince had been thrown into danger once again. "Derek, please, you need rest," Zalcor finally said, his voice barely a whisper in the stillness of the room. Derek shook his head, his eyes glued to the control panel. "We don't have the luxury of rest. I'll sleep when we're safe. Zalcor, right now, we need to get the ship repaired or we're as good as dead." Zalcor couldn't argue with that. Derek's words rang with truth. If they didn't make it out of this moon base alive, there was no hope left. They had only a limited amount of resources to repair the ship, and every passing minute brought the Illyrian fleet closer. But it was more than just survival now. It was about something deeper. It was about keeping a promise that had already been kept, even in the face of impossible odds. Derek had done more for Zalcor than anyone ever had. The moment of realization. As Zalcor sat there, his mind whirling with thoughts of his people, his empire, and his father's legacy, a wave of emotion washed over him. He had spent so many years thinking that being a prince meant fighting for power, for dominance over other species. That was what his father had taught him, what the Illyrian Empire had taught him. But now, sitting in this broken ship with Derek, the prince realized something far more important. It wasn't about power. It wasn't about domination. It was about trust. It was about the promises that were made and the strength it took to keep them, no matter the cost. Zalcor stood up, his legs unsteady at first. He walked over to where Derek was working, his heart pounding in his chest. The human was still completely absorbed in his work, his mind racing as he made quick adjustments to the ship's engine systems. But this time, Zalcor didn't just stand by. This time, he wasn't going to let Derek do it alone. "I can help," the prince said, his voice steady but filled with the weight of what he was about to say. Derek finally looked up at him, surprise flickering in his tired eyes. "What do you mean?" "I've been trained to lead, to command, to protect," Zalcor said, his voice thick with emotion. "I can help you fix the ship. We can do this together." Derek stared at him for a moment, as if searching for something in the prince's eyes. And then, slowly, he nodded. "All right," Derek said with a quiet smile. "Let's get to work." Working together. The next few hours passed in a blur. Zalcor worked alongside Derek, learning quickly, using the training he had received as a prince to keep the ship's failing systems intact. They patched up holes in the ship's armor, rerouted power from the auxiliary engines to the primary thrusters, and manually recalibrated the communication system. It wasn't easy. The prince had never been good with machines, but Derek patiently guided him through every step, showing him how to fix what had seemed impossible. As they worked side by side, Zalcor couldn't help but feel a strange sense of pride. He had always thought he was above humans, too proud to admit that he needed help. But Derek had proved him wrong at every turn. The human wasn't just fixing the ship. He was fixing something deeper within the prince, something that had been broken for years. They worked tirelessly, ignoring the exhaustion creeping into their limbs, until finally, the ship's systems came back online. The engines hummed to life once again, the lights flickered back to full strength, and the ship's hull creaked with the newfound power. "We did it," Zalcor said, his voice full of awe. "The ship is fixed." Derek leaned back in his chair, wiping sweat from his brow. "We did it. Together." The enemy closes in. But as they looked out of the viewport, the moon base's safety was short-lived. The silhouette of an enemy warship appeared on the horizon. It was massive, its dark shape like a predator in the night, and it was coming for them. Zalcor's heart sank. "They've found us." Derek's face hardened. "We don't have much time. We need to get out of here now." Zalcor nodded, his mind racing. "I'll take the helm. You ready?" Derek glanced at him, and for the first time, Zalcor saw a flicker of respect in the human's eyes. "Let's do it." The final escape. The ship shook as it lifted off from the surface of the moon. The enemy warship fired on them immediately, the sound of explosions shaking the hull. But this time, Zalcor didn't panic. He didn't feel fear. The weight of his father's teachings seemed to fade away, replaced by the undeniable strength of the promise Derek had kept. As the human mechanic guided the ship through a dangerous series of evasive maneuvers, Zalcor saw everything in a new light. He was no longer a prince clinging to the past. He was a fighter, a survivor, and with Derek at his side, he knew they had a chance. "Hold on," Derek shouted as the ship bucked and rolled, narrowly avoiding another missile. Zalcor gritted his teeth. He didn't care about the Empire anymore. He didn't care about his status. He cared about keeping the promise Derek had made him all those years ago. They were in this together, and nothing would stop them now. As the enemy warship closed in, Zalcor steered the ship into the depths of space, the stars ahead shimmering with the possibilities of the future. The ship surged forward, its engines roaring as it sliced through the cold expanse of space. The sound of the alarms, the blaring warning systems, had faded into the background, now just a distant hum in Zalcor's ears. His hands gripped the controls with determination as they shot through space, barely avoiding another blast from the pursuing warship. The moon base was long behind them, now only a distance in the rear view, but the enemy was relentless. They had to keep moving, and they had to keep fighting. Zalcor had always thought of himself as a prince, as a ruler who commanded armies and demanded respect. But in the face of danger, in the heat of the moment, he was learning something entirely new. He wasn't just a prince anymore. He was a fighter, a leader, and most importantly, he was a man who had learned to place his trust in a human who had never given up on him. Beside him, Derek worked quickly, his fingers flying across the console. The human mechanic didn't seem worried. His focus was absolute, his concentration unwavering. He didn't even flinch as the ship rocked again, narrowly missing another missile. Zalcor watched him in awe. This was the true power of a promise, not just in words, but in actions. "Derek," Zalcor said, his voice breaking the tense silence. I never understood before, but now I see." Derek glanced at him, a look of curiosity in his eyes. "See what?" Zalcor took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. The strength of a promise. What it really means to keep one. "I've always thought that power and force were the only things that mattered. But you—" He paused, unable to finish his thought. Derek had done more than just keep a promise. He had shown Zalcor the value of loyalty, of trust, of standing by someone no matter what. The prince had never known anything like it. "Zalcor," Derek said, his voice calm and steady, "you're learning. You're already fighting for more than yourself. You're fighting for us." Zalcor turned his gaze back to the stars outside, the vast unknown that stretched endlessly before them. He had never felt more uncertain, and yet he also felt something else, something that he hadn't allowed himself to feel before: hope, the final chase. But there was no time for reflection. The enemy ships were closing in again, their weapons charging. Zalcor's pulse quickened as he saw their trajectory, a perfect line for a deadly shot. The warship ahead was waiting for them to make a mistake, to slip up just once. "We can't outrun them, Derek," Zalcor said, his voice tight with urgency. "We need to fight back." Derek didn't hesitate. You're right. We don't have a choice anymore. It's time to give them everything we've got. Zalcor was stunned. The human wasn't backing down. Not now, when the enemy was so close. And then he understood. This was what Derek meant by fighting for something more. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about standing together against all odds, against an entire empire. And for the first time, Zalcor felt what it meant to fight for someone else. All right, the prince said, his voice steady. Let's make this count. The final stand. Derek took control of the ship's weapon systems, his hands moving with lightning speed as he fired back at the enemy fleet. The first missile he launched hit the enemy warship dead center, sending it spiraling into the void. But it wasn't enough. The remaining ships were still coming, their firepower overwhelming. Take evasive maneuvers, Zalcor shouted, his eyes scanning the approaching enemy. We need to keep them off balance. Derek pulled hard on the controls, spinning the ship in a wide arc as another barrage of missiles erupted around them. The ship rocked violently, but Derek held firm, guiding them through the chaos. They were no longer just surviving. They were fighting back, fighting together. The ship was now taking hits, sparks flying from the control panels. The systems were failing again, but Derek didn't slow down. He was determined to make it out of this. Zalcor could feel the humans' resolve, and it made him fight harder, push further. We're not stopping, Derek said through gritted teeth, his voice barely audible over the roar of the ship's engines. I promise. Zalcor didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He trusted Derek with his life, and in that moment, he understood more than ever what that meant. The unexpected turn. Just as it seemed like they were out of options, a massive explosion tore through the enemy fleet. For a moment, everything went silent. Then, the remains of the ships that had been chasing them started to drift into the darkness of space. Derek stared out the window, his eyes wide in disbelief. What just happened? Zalcor looked out as well, his jaw dropping as he saw what had just occurred. A third party had appeared. Another ship, larger than anything he'd ever seen, had come from the depths of space, firing at the enemy fleet with overwhelming force. It destroyed the remaining warships in a matter of seconds, leaving nothing but debris in its wake. That's not possible, Zalcor whispered. Who saved us? Derek's voice was thick with awe. I don't know, but I think we just got a second chance. As the new ship moved closer, Zalcor's eyes widened. He could see a symbol on the side, something unfamiliar, something human. They're human, Zalcor said, disbelief in his voice. It's a human ship. Derek's face lit up with understanding. They came for us. As the ship landed alongside theirs, a sudden wave of relief washed over Zalcor. They had done it. They had survived. And somehow, the human race had just proved that they were far more capable, far more powerful, than Zalcor had ever given them credit for. The promise fulfilled. The doors of the massive ship opened, revealing a group of humans who stepped forward, armed and ready. But instead of attacking, they extended a hand, offering help, offering safety. And standing at the front of the group was someone familiar. A voice called from the crowd. Derek! Zalcor looked at Derek, who had turned pale in shock. You know them? Derek nodded, his voice full of surprise and gratitude. I didn't think they'd come. But it looks like they kept their promise, too. The humans on board the new ship had known Derek from past. They were his people, his allies. And now, they had come to repay the promise Derek had made to Zalcor. A promise that had changed the course of history. Zalcor stood in awe as Derek walked forward, his face filled with emotion. The prince followed him, his heart heavy with gratitude. He had never known that such loyalty, such strength, could come from a human. And now, with the help of Derek and his allies, they were about to take the fight to the Illyrian Empire. For the first time in his life, Zalcor understood the true power of a promise. And he realized that, no matter the cost, the human's promise would be the key to saving not just him, but the entire galaxy. The tension in the air was thick as Zalcor stood on the deck of the human warship, watching as the stars streaked past him. The ship, now fully repaired and with fresh energy coursing through its engines, hummed with power. Derek stood next to him, looking out at the vastness of space. His face calm, but his eyes reflecting the same uncertainty that had been in Zalcor's own heart just days ago. They had come so far, together. "I can't believe it," Zalcor said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You really have people out here. People who trust you." Derek's lips curled into a faint smile. "Yeah, I didn't expect them to come either, but I guess I've done my part to earn their trust, just like you've done yours." Zalcor nodded, his chest swelling with a mix of emotions. The prince had spent his entire life believing that the strength of his empire, his birthright, was all that mattered. He had been trained to view the world through the lens of power, ruthless, calculated, and absolute. But now, standing at the edge of the galaxy that was filled with uncertainty, he had learned that the true power lay in something else entirely. Trust, loyalty, promises. He turned to Derek, his eyes locking onto the humans for the first time in a way that felt different, more profound. "I owe you everything," Zalcor said, his voice thick with emotion. "I never understood what it meant to trust someone, but you've shown me what it truly means to have a bond." Derek turned toward him, his gaze softening. "I told you before, Zalcor, my word is everything, and I'll never break it." The prince felt a surge of something deep within his chest. Gratitude, admiration, something more than he had ever known before. The cold, distant ruler who had once believed he was above all others was gone. In his place stood someone who understood that power wasn't something to wield, but something to nurture. It wasn't about dominance. It was about the strength to protect, the strength to keep a promise. The final mission. The human ship lurched slightly as it neared the heart of the Illyrian Empire's remaining strongholds. The coordinates were locked, and Zalcor's heart began to pound as he saw the fleet ahead. A massive, imposing force, a testament to the power of the empire he had once ruled. Derek, standing beside him, was ready. There was no hesitation in his stance. "You ready?" he asked, turning to the prince. Zalcor swallowed hard, but there was no fear in his voice. "Let's end this. For good." The battle ahead would be their last chance to take down the Illyrian Empire once and for all. Their allies, the humans who had joined them in this fight, were ready. Derek had brought them together. But now it was up to Zalcor to lead them. For the first time, the prince was confident in his role, not because of his birthright, but because of everything he had learned from Derek. "We have one shot at this," Zalcor said, his voice clear and strong. "We strike hard and fast, and we don't give them a chance to regroup. We've come too far to fail now." The warship's engines powered up, and the hum of the ship grew louder as the crew began to prepare for battle. Zalcor took his place at the center of the command room, his eyes locked onto the screens ahead. This was it, the moment they had been fighting for, the final showdown. As they broke through the outer defenses of the Illyrian fleet, enemy ships began to fire. The ship rocked violently as missiles exploded nearby. Zalcor felt the adrenaline surge through his veins as the ship veered sharply to the left, avoiding another barrage of missiles. "Hold steady." Derek's voice rang out as the ship's weapon systems came to life, the ship firing back with deadly precision. The battle raged around them, explosions lighting up the dark void of space as ships collided in a frenzy of fire and steel. But despite the chaos, Zalcor's focus never wavered. He could see it now. This was his moment to prove that he wasn't just a prince by birth, but a leader by choice. The ship bucked and jolted, but Zalcor kept his hands steady on controls, guiding them to the tumult of enemy fire. The enemy's collapse. As the battle intensified, Zalcor could see the enemy warships begin to falter. Derek's precise attacks had taken out the shields, and now it was up to the prince to land the final blow. With a deep breath, Zalcor issued a command to fire everything they had left. The ship fired its last round of missiles, a direct hit to the core of the Illyrian flagship. The explosion lit up the entire fleet, and the shockwave rippled to the remaining ships. One by one, the enemy ships began to break apart, unable to withstand the combined might of their forces. "We did it," Derek said, his voice filled with a mix of relief and exhaustion. Zalcor exhaled deeply, staring at the wreckage of the empire that had once been his own. He had done it. They had done it. Together. The aftermath. In the quiet after the battle, Zalcor stood on the deck of the ship, gazing out at the vastness of space. The war was over, but the cost had been high. The galaxy would never be the same, but neither would Zalcor. He had lost his empire, but he had gained something far more valuable. Derek walked up beside him, his face tired but triumphant. "You did it," he said, a hint of pride in his voice. "You led us to victory." Zalcor looked at him, his chest heavy with emotion. "No," he said softly. "We did it. You and me. You kept your promise, Derek. And for that, I will never forget." Derek smiled. "I told you I would." Zalcor stood a little taller, knowing that the future ahead was uncertain. The Illyrian Empire was no more, but what came next was in his hands. And as long as he had people like Derek by his side, he knew he could face anything. "Father, look," Zalcor whispered to himself, his voice trembling as he thought of the legacy his family had left behind. But now, as he looked at the humans standing beside him, he knew that legacy was no longer defined by blood or empire. It was defined by the promise Derek had made to him and the bond that had saved them both. "I see it now, Derek," Zalcor said, his voice steady. "And I will build a new legacy, one built on loyalty, trust, and promises kept." Derek turned toward him, nodding in understanding. Together, they had survived the greatest trial of their lives. And now, the future was theirs to shape. For the first time, Zalcor felt at peace. Not because of his birthright, but because he had finally found what truly mattered. And he had Derek to thank for that.